Then Moses answered, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" The Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" He said, "A staff." And he said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, "Put out your hand and catch it by the tail." So he put out his hand and caught it, and he became a staff in his hand. Then we may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Again the Lord said to him, "Put your hand inside your cloak." And he put his hand inside his cloak. And when he put it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, "Put your hand back inside your cloak." So he put his hand back inside his cloak. And when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, "Or listen to the first sign, we may believe the latter sign. If you will not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground." But Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." Then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes his mute, or deaf, or seeing, or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Then therefore go, and I will be with your mouth, and teach you what you shall speak." But he said, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is there not Aaron your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people. He shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff, with which you shall do the signs." May God bless this reading. Sorry.
Well, good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Charlie's a good dear friend of mine and a colleague. Charlie and Cindy are our missionaries with team over almost 30 years of ministry in Chad, Africa. Since 2002, he's been seconded to Heritage Bible College for the first 11 years, and now for the last 6 years, he's been with Emmanuel Bible College. So I'm just going to turn the time over to my friend Charlie.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you this morning. It's a real treat. We have been able to have the privilege of serving together, Tim and I, for a number of years. Matter of fact, when Tim was looking for somebody that could do the job he's doing, I thought of Tim because of his deep level of experience, both within Tim and within the Chinese world, which was a part of the world that we were really seeking to go back to because that was our roots as a mission as well. Team started in 1890 in China and then spread around the world from there. I want to just give you a little bit of our background. My wife is Cindy. Cindy is a missionary kid from Brazil, so we've got two missionary kids there that have, it was the hardest thing for her was to translate her Brazil experience as well as her Portuguese language into French. She still speaks French with a Portuguese accent. But I remember when we first arrived in Chad in 1987, I had driven across the Sahara Desert, and she had flown down from Paris with the boys, and I got lost in the desert, and she arrived 3 days before I did, and so she had no introduction to the country at all. And I can remember the first night in Mundu, which was where we were based in the south of Chad. It was dark, darker than she had ever seen it. You could hear the drums in the village and the frogs in the swamp, and she just cried. And I realized how intensely even as a missionary kid, it was to be in another part of the world and serve. And so we served for 15 years in Chad. Our family grew during that time. And so we have 3 sons. Chad, who's in the middle there with his little niece on his lap. He and his wife Jen are serving in Sierra Leone with a development organization. Our second son, Colin, and his wife, Rachel. Colin is at Tyndale. Rachel is Africa Inland Missions short-term coordinator, so some of you might see her from time to time. And then our youngest, Cameron, who's the father of the 2 little girls in that picture on the right at the bottom, is married to Alicia, who's a nurse at Sick Kids, and they live in Cambridge. And Cameron teaches international studies at the University of Waterloo. All 3 of the boys continue to connect with Africa. So if any of you are thinking about becoming missionaries to Africa, become aware that something more than just bugs gets under your skin out there. Our kids are just far away as a result of that. And then my dad served for 40 years with Team, along with my stepmother. After my mother passed away, my dad went out and taught at Prairie Bible Institute and met Betsy Burley, who was a teacher there, and they went back to Chad and then to South Africa. So we have a strong missions background as a family. I grew up in that environment, and yet I had to wrestle as a teenager, and it was when I was about 16 years old that we went back to Chad, and I was struggling with being a missionary kid and all those kind of things. And the country of Chad at that point was going through a cultural revolution. And the government had required everybody in the country that was Chadian of origin to go through traditional initiation rites, which involved demon worship and some very, 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 very dangerous kinds of practices. As a result, there was a reaction within the church, and many Christians were standing up for their faith. And I was watching and hearing stories of pastors being buried alive for their faith and left with 1 foot or 1 hand sticking out of the ground so that anyone else that came along would know that's what happens if you don't go along with these practices. And it really hit me until one day they brought a man in who had for his faith had been stuffed into a barrel and with a lid on it, and they left the barrel out in the sun after they'd beaten him to a pulp. Left him out in the sun, and the only thing that they passed him was a little bit of food and water through the bunghole in the barrel. And for 2 weeks, he was in that barrel in the sun. And when they brought him into the hospital, he had lost his mind, and you could not walk into the room without just being knocked out by the smell. And I'm sitting there as a 16-year-old thinking, you know what? This Christian thing is a whole lot more than just simply Sunday morning. This is about a whole life commitment. And in a very powerful way, I saw it. And it was at that point that I said to the Lord, fully from the bottom of my heart, God, not only am I your child, and I thank you for that, but I want to follow you. I want you to have the driver's wheel in my life, not me. And I'll go where you take me. And that's a scary thing. And to this day, as I work with young people in Bible colleges, and I talk about missions, I sense that resistance because we come to Christ thinking, now my life is going to get better. And when you look at the early church, actually, when you came to Christ, that was the beginning of your problems. And but knowing that he walked with you through that. So we served in Chad, and we continue to do that. I go back for about a month a year, working with Chadian pastors. I speak 4 languages. My wife speaks 5 as a result of these experiences. And Chad, if you look, is that country right in the center of the map of Africa. But if you were to look at the map of Africa in a different way, it could look like this. And this is what's very significant. A lot of people think of Africa as a place where as a continent where the gospel has had tremendous impact and really turned the world upside down. Well, not once you get above that white line. Below that white line represents the part of Africa that was animist, still is largely animist, and has responded powerfully to the gospel. Some of the largest church movements in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. But once you get to that green line, you're talking about a Muslim world where less than 1% of the population may have even heard the gospel in a way that they can understand. And one of the challenges in Africa today is that sub-Saharan part of Africa, that church becoming missionary and reaching out to the north, when most of them, especially those along that line, whether it's in Nigeria or in Chad or in the Sudan or in Kenya, Somalia, they have suffered deeply for centuries. And they would just rather the whole north literally go to hell And it's only a changed heart that sees them reaching out. And so a big part of what we've been involved in is developing a missionary heart in the national churches in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in Chad, although I've had these conversations in Congo and other places as well. The country of Chad is easy to recognize. I'll just give a little bit of background here. If you look at it, that right in the middle of the map, it looks like a man with an army cap on looking west. Can you see it? Got a cap on his head, he's looking west. We're down in the chin, down in the bottom part. So now when you look at the map of Africa, you can see it. And that line between Muslim and sub-Saharan Africa is right about a third of the way up the country. And so we work in a denomination of about 300,000 believers. Today there are 3,000 local churches meeting this Sunday morning in Chad. And yet that heart to reach Muslims, even those among them, still remains to grow. The north is the Sahara Desert, the largest desert in the world. Also the largest oasis in the world is in Faya-Largeau, 75 kilometers long in the north. And that lifestyle that you've seen in pictures continues. I've flown in a small plane over big stretches of the Sahara Desert in northern Chad, and you still see camel caravans as they've been moving for centuries. It's still possible to be born in Chad in the northern part, to grow up, to get married, to have a family and kids, and never, in a way that you can understand, hear the gospel. And people are going into eternity every day in North Africa because they have never understood the difference between the message of Christ and the dead end that Islam is. And to me, that's almost impossible to understand. The center of life in the north is still the mosque, and when you leave that center and you become a follower of Jesus, you lose everything. You lose your family, you lose your way of gaining a living, everything. The south is very different. This was a couple that my wife and I worked with. As a matter of fact, he and his wife had been students of my parents, so imagine the privilege of having this man mentor us. Both of them are now with the Lord, but this represents hundreds and hundreds of pastors who often don't have a great level of education, but are continuing to grow the church in Chad. The south is crisscrossed by rivers which routinely flood. We're just going to start the rainy season in Chad in a few months. And so getting around is a challenge. I would often have to wait for hours until I could find a barge that would take me across a river. And if you break down, you fix the car yourself. No CAA out there. And so Mission Aviation Fellowship is a big part of what helps us to be able to get into some of the most remote areas. The churches look about like that. That particular church seats about 170 people. So about, well, less than what this column would be here of benches. In that church, very interesting church, in that church, 40 different languages. Can you imagine that? Speaking in a church, like, how do you do that? The country of Chad itself, 10 million people, has about 137 languages. And then 2 trade languages, French and Arabic, Chad Arabic. Other churches in the cities are quite a bit bigger. This one seats about 1,200, and you have about 500 people who can't get in the church and are outside listening to the message as it's preached. And then in the areas that are predominantly Muslim, the churches that grow up are little grass things. Notice the mats on the floor. That's because that's a church for Muslim background believers. And when they come to church, it's like a little mosque. And they come in and they sit on the mats. They take their shoes off because they're in the presence of God. They put their foreheads to the ground on their knees, worshiping God. When you hear them sing, if you didn't know it, you would think it was a mosque. But once you understand Chad Arabic, you realize that they're actually singing praise songs to the Savior in the rhythm and tones from their background. My ministry was training Chadian pastors. I go regularly out, still doing conferences with Chadian pastors and also with leaders. At one time, I coordinated a whole network of Bible schools in 6 different languages in the south of the country, and I trained the leadership, and these guys became some of my closest friends. And our schools look like that. I've been teaching at Heritage and Emmanuel in Cambridge and in Kitchener, and we talk about smart classrooms and all this, and this place had logs on the floor. And this is where we were training pastors, sometimes just under a tree. And so this past summer I was back again and doing a seminar that walks people through biblical theology from a cultural point of view. What does the gospel say to the culture of Chad? And it keeps me fresh. One of the goal, ultimately, is that Chadians, as well as our churches here, would have that vision of seeing the gospel ringing to the ends of the earth. That's the hope. And in Chad, if you want to see what the church looks like at the end of the earth, there's one there, under the mountain, under that palm tree. That's the vision, is to hear Jesus' name being pronounced all different ways from every tribe and nation under the sun. So I want to talk to you a bit today about that whole bit of what is it that God is calling us to be and as his people. And I want to think just a little bit about the idea of hands, and you've picked up from our reading where I'm going to go with that. But I have always been fascinated by hands and how much they're a key part in changing our world. We often really severely underestimate our hands, but they're amazing, amazing parts of our body. If you look at the hand, and you have one in front of you, but this is a picture of it as well. Okay, the hand is actually one of the most complicated joints in the body. Did you know that a quarter of the bones in your body are found in your hand? That's just, and when you damage it, you find out what that's like. My life took a really severe turn back about 20 years ago when I had a motorcycle accident in Chad. And now today I can only bend my hand about this far as a result of that because of that complex system being interrupted. I find it hard to believe that I am here by accident as a human being when I look just simply at the complexity of my hand. Did you know there's no muscles in your hand? Your hand is all controlled by tendons that run all the way to your elbow, which is when you overuse your fingers and your elbow starts to hurt and you wonder why, and that's because it's all being pulled one way or the other from back here. It's the most amazing tool that you could possibly imagine. It's the thing that also distinguishes us from animals. Animals just simply cannot do, even primates cannot do what we can do with our hands. They're also, as a result, they've kind of entered into our language in very important ways. We talk about hands-on ministry, for instance. We talk about a handoff when we pass it to somebody else. We talk about being handy with your hands, or being handsome if you're not very handy. We talk about handling things, right? We talk about handmade. It just enters, right? It's one of the oldest words in the English language. The word actually goes back to its Indo-European roots thousands of years ago. It consisted in the original languages. If you have dexterity, from the Latin word for your right hand, for right, if you have dexterity, that means you're good with your hands. If you're sinister or left-handed, you can't be trusted. At least that's what our tradition tells us anyway. And in Africa, it's that way. I apologize to those of you who are sinister here. We use it in a kind of negative way. We say he had a hand in it, or he was caught red-handed. We talk about a grasping old miser like Scrooge. Again, that reference to those hands holding onto things. And then in positive ways, we talk about it too. We talk about hands of mercy. We talk about caring hands. We talk about a healing touch. Think of when someone prayed with you and put their hands on your arm or on your shoulders and what that meant to you. We talk in church about the right hand of fellowship, don't we? We talk about the word embrace from French literally means embrasser, to take you in your arms, to embrace you. And so in the Bible, this idea crops up over and over again. It's not just uniquely in Exodus. We find the Hebrews, for instance, when they swore an oath, and Abraham does this with his servant when he sends off his servant to get Isaac in Genesis chapter 24. They swore an oath by placing their hand under the other one's thigh, which kind of creeps us out a little bit as Westerners. But that was the way it was. And it's still, that idea exists still in the Middle East. In Genesis 47, Jacob makes Joseph promise to bury him back in Canaan with that same kind of oath. And then, of course, we find in Exodus 15 and on through the Bible, the hand of God being on us is the mark of his power and his favor. God goes further than that. He says, no one, and think about this, he says, no one can snatch you out of my hands. And Jesus mentions that in John 10:28. And then, do you remember when Thomas doubted that this was truly the risen Christ? What was the proof for him? It was those nail-pierced hands, right? Put your hands in the nail, thrust your hands in my side, and you will know that it's really me that's here. And so there's really, that was the mark of Jesus being the risen Lord, the risen Lord. So that takes us to another reference in the Bible, and I want to take you to Genesis chapter 4. This one speaks very much to finding our place as a people of God. In a world that's changing really rapidly, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a few of those changes, and what hands might have to do with that. So we're going to look at God's calling of Moses. a man who definitely thought he had his retirement years all sewn up. He was 80 years old. Most of his ideas now, and had for the last 40 years, revolved around sheep. Sheep. So he's 80. He's been a shepherd for the last 40 years. His social skills have probably severely declined over that period of time. And then God speaks to him in a very powerful way. So if you remember, he's out on the mountain in the wilderness with his sheep, and he sees this bush burning, and he says, this is an experience like I have not had before. Not all of us get called with that kind of a challenging experience. But he looks at that, and he says, I've got something to hear. And God speaks to him out of that burning bush. And so in Exodus chapter 3, we're told Moses said to God, verse 13, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? People are good at that, aren't they? They kind of look at us and they go, well, what makes you think that you can take this on, that you're the gifted person? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. That's a powerful statement. I am God. And so you will come in my name. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and I am thus to be remembered, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. And so the conversation goes on, and we'll skip down to the beginning of chapter 4, and we read that as we were speaking together, as we had the reading at the beginning. And then Moses answered and said, but behold, they're not going to listen to me. They will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they'll say the Lord did not appear to you. And then God says to him, what's that in your hand? Now, understand that what Moses had as tools were not considered to be status symbols, either in his day or today. It was a stick. It was a piece of wood that was well worn, it was polished, but it was the mark of really lower class. He wasn't someone that was considered to be a leader, at least not anymore. And so when Moses is thinking about this calling God has on his life, he has this fear. He just says, I can't do that. It's 40 years since I talked to anybody. I've been way out of the loop. I've got no idea what the issues are, and certainly the young people have no idea who I am too. And so God says, what's that in your hand? And essentially what's in his hand is this rough piece of wood that's the mark of the caste of the lowest of country people, the shepherd. And I know that because I've lived among shepherds in North Africa as well. And that same lifestyle is there. And Moses is thinking, what in the world can I do with that? And so God says to him, we'll toss it on the ground. And Moses kind of rails internally. And he says, what good is that going to do? But he does it. And so he throws it on the ground. It becomes a snake. And Moses flees with good reason, because in that part of the world, snakes are the enemy. Very, very dangerous. Vipers and cobras, and your life can end really quickly. And God says to him, pick it up. Not by the way you'd expect, behind the head so they can't bite you, but pick it up by the tail. And Moses says to himself, well, I'm definitely not in an ordinary story here. I might as well. And so he picks up the snake. It instantly becomes a staff in his hand. And Moses goes, oh. He still has problems. And God says to him, put your hand in your cloak. Now, when he puts his hand in his cloak, something really horrible happens. Because one of the biggest fears that people of that era had was of falling ill with leprosy. We don't know if it's exactly what we know today as leprosy, but one of the marks was the skin turning almost completely white, losing its normal coloring. And that was associated with losing feeling in the hands and feet. Ultimately, you would be completely crippled. But the worst of it was that you lost your family, you lost your home, you were cast out. And so he looks at his hand in horror. And he says, this could be my future. And then God says, put it back. And he pulls it out again, and it's clean and as pure as it was before he put it in the first time. Now, you would think that with two miracles like this, in terms of calling, most of us in missions didn't have callings like this. I often wished I did, because at times when I was really down, I said, God, show yourself to me like you did to Moses. And he just says, hang in there. Do you trust me? But in this case, he's working with a specifically called person, but especially worried kind of guy. And Moses still has worries, and he says, I might be able to turn a staff into a snake and back again, but I'm not much of a speaker. No one will ever listen to me. And this is where God says something really profound to Moses. He says something that speaks to every physical limitation that I know of. Moses says, God, I can't talk. I can't get my tongue around words. Apparently I stammer. And God says to him, who do you think made your mouth? Me. And then he goes on and he says, who makes the deaf, the mute, the blind, the sighted, and all those other handicaps and abilities? Yes, not just the abilities, but the handicaps. I do, for my glory. Because it's when God works through my weakness that he shows himself as strong. Because if God worked through my strengths, I would be running in my own strength. I would be proud of what I could do. I would get to the point where I thought I really didn't need him. And yet the power of God is demonstrated so powerfully when it's ordinary people doing extraordinary things because an extraordinary God is at work in them. The amazing thing is that even with that conversation, Moses is still struggling here. After all of that, and he says, I can't do it. Send my brother instead. I think you should send somebody else. And then God's angered with him. And he says to Moses, you know what, Moses? You still think that this is about you, don't you? It's never been about you. I can use whatever, like a stick, and whomever, like an 80-year-old shepherd, that I want to. And he could have taken a young man. He could have had someone at the height of society. He didn't. He chose to use the ordinary things in this world. And this leads us to reflect on another really important biblical principle, which is that God uses our hands. And they make changes. They make a difference. The psalmist, probably Moses in Psalm 90, says, affirm the work of our hands. The preacher in Ecclesiastes 9, verse 10 says, whatever your hands find to do, do it with all your might. And sometimes we think that God only uses certain kind of hands, like the especially gifted ones, the beautiful ones, the young ones. Sometimes we think that God only uses a certain kind or a certain age or a certain color of hand. God just simply says to Moses, what's in your hand? And one of the wonderful things about missions today is that more than ever before, the mission of God here and around the world is being accomplished by all kinds of hands, in all kinds of changing places, in all kinds of changing ways. You know, when my parents first went to the field, my dad applied to, at that point, OMF. It was China Inland Mission. And they said to him, you're too old. We can't use you. You'll never learn a language. My dad was 29 years old. And today we're sending 80-year-olds to the mission field. It's just amazing. And I think God demonstrates some really powerful things. So I just want to take you just really quickly in the few minutes that are left here. God's doing some unbelievable things in terms of transition. Things are changing. And I just want to scan some ways that God's using his people. In Europe, to most mission scholars, Europe represented the ashes of a post-Christian first world, where the church once was relevant, but now very few people will even listen to the good news of Christ. Missionary work was slow and small, but now the world is flooding into Europe because what's happening is the whole of the Muslim world especially is moving into Europe. And we've seen this over the last number of years. And missions and churches are rediscovering ministry to the diaspora from around the world in places they would never have imagined before. Who could have thought of that even 20 years ago? And yet that's our reality today in Europe. And it's waking up the churches of Europe as well, as they're rediscovering the mission of God. The Middle East, in North Africa, the Middle East, in case you missed the news, has been in a ferment for quite a while and continues to be that. The news this morning was of riots in Algeria, and that's just one more piece added to so many other parts. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and God's at work doing some absolutely amazing things. Once largely Christian. At one point, that was the center of the Christian world, by the way, where that circle is. It's almost been exclusively Muslim since the 7th century, but God is making a change. Did you know that in the last 10 years of the 1990s, okay, from 1990 to 2000, did you know that more Muslims came to Christ in that 10-year span than in the previous 13 centuries of Islamic history put together? So when we think that God's not doing something amazing, he's out there and he's using ordinary people, like us, when they move into our neighborhoods and close to us. In relatively stable Turkey, the first mission field of the Bible, population of 75 million, only 3,500 Christians, evangelical Christians. But if Turkey responds to Jesus Christ, a gateway opens to the whole of Central Asia, which are all Turkic-based languages. And God is at work doing something there. In East Asia, and you're very aware of this part of the world, I know, China has a population of 1.35 billion. 1 in 5 people in the world are Chinese. That's a language that I need to learn, obviously. It's an economic powerhouse. Most everyone wants to learn English. We don't know how big the church is. Somewhere between 40 million and 120 million. We do not know. And yet movements like the Back to Jerusalem movement and others are seeing parts of the Church of China popping up everywhere else in the world in ways we never expected, we never could have imagined. In the Philippines, the world's 12th largest country, by the way. It's all islands, but it's the 12th largest country. Sorry, I'll get us back to that. Okay, I'm giving away where I'm going, aren't I? They have 92 million people. There are 3,000 missionaries out under a Philippine passport in more than 75 agencies around the world. Those are formal missionaries, 3,000. Many, many, many more than that who are out as oil workers and nannies, especially in the Muslim world. In South Korea, in 1975, South Korea sent its first 24 missionaries out. In 1991, they had 1,200. I had the privilege of doing a master's degree in Wheaton, Illinois, and we had a whole section, about half of our students in the missiology program were Korean. And by 2006, there were over 13,000. Today, there's over 20,000 missionaries out of South Korea to the rest of the world. Each year, South Korea sends out 1,100 new missionaries. That's more than all the rest of the West combined, coming just out of South Korea. And in many very resistant areas of the world. Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim nation in the world, has a policy of ethnic displacement. They're moving people from one island that's overcrowded to another. And guess where a lot of these ethnic Muslims are being moved to? Papua, which is the only island in all of the islands that belong to Indonesia that is primarily Christian. That's where Don Richardson worked and where Peace Child was written. And today, Papuans are ministering to Muslims who are being forcibly moved into their area. Latin America, Brazil, has a population of almost 200 million. Evangelicals are about 50, 60 million. It's estimated that by 2020, Christianity Today Online, this is their figure, it will be almost half of the population of Brazil that are evangelical, and they're becoming a missionary sending church as well. I want to just lay a light on the last one, and that's the one that might make you ask a question. How in the world is Canada one of those significant things? Well, people are coming to Canada. Have you noticed that? Our neighborhoods have really changed. And it is making us a missionary church. Either that or we fail in ways that we never expected before. And people had thought that Muslim ministries were just for the specially trained are finding out, guess what? My next door neighbor is a Muslim. The person in front of me at the line at the grocery store is Muslim. Just think about what's happened. About 250,000 immigrants come into Canada every year. More than half of Toronto was born outside of Canada, coming from some of the least reached and most closed parts of the world. Who knew? If we can't get there, God brings many of them here. 8 out of 10 foreign students will never enter a Canadian home off campus during their studies here. That's a heartbreak. That's why student ministries are so important. Foreign students that are here return home to key leadership in their home countries, and the networks that we make here extend to the ends of the earth. They open doors. We meet a Persian family here, and we form a friendship. And all of a sudden, we find out that we have this welcome into their whole family network, all the way back into Iran or into Saudi Arabia. And God's doing that for a reason. And so God's using all kinds of hands in our changing world. You can talk to Tim and other people about long-term career, short-term projects, tent making, where you go and you work and you support yourself. But that's not the only thing to support. It also may give you a passport into the country that you wouldn't have had otherwise. We call that creative access. Teaching English, business as mission, enabling global South missions, that's a phenomenal change that's happened. More than half of the missionaries going out across the world today are not from the West anymore. It's about 60% now from the global South. And then, of course, reaching the diaspora in our own backyard. I want to finish up with this, though. Take a look at your hands for a moment. I don't think that Moses ever looked at his hands quite the same way before as he did after that experience in the desert. You know, he knew what God had done. The memory of that horribly leprous hand made him appreciate the wholeness of what God had granted him in a very real and powerful way. Look at your own hands. God's placed a lot in those hands. God has given you abilities. God has given you experiences in your life that have shaped you and informed you. God has given resources to you, financial, but otherwise as well, in your hands. And sometimes those hands represent failure as well. And even failure has taught us what an amazingly capable and forgiving and enabling God that we have. What would the history of Israel have been like if Moses had hung back with his fears and sense of inadequacy? I can't do it. Send somebody else. If Moses had rejected the mission and the transition that God was bringing into his life, the history of Israel and the history of the church would have been very different. I don't know if we would have been sitting here this morning. Of course, God's powerful. God will do what he intends to do. But God uses pivotal people, ordinary people, at pivotal times in history. And I believe, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that today is a pivotal time in history. Some things are happening today that have never been seen in history before. And I could talk to you about that for an hour. The history of our faith as believers is one of mission, one of a willingness to change, a willingness to take on the uncomfortable, a willingness to go out of where we are familiar and where we are competent into the places where we are unfamiliar and incompetent. That's the history. And as you look at the people God has used, if you really knew them, you would understand that. God using very ordinary people to change and to effect extraordinary change. In dependency, as I've got written on my door at Emmanuel Bible College, in dependency upon an infinitely extraordinary God. That's what we were singing about this morning. We go to raise his name, whether it's locally or globally. We go where he is not worshipped so that he will be worshipped. And as John Piper says, when God is worshipped, we won't need everywhere. We won't need missions anymore. Missions exist because worship doesn't yet, whether it's our neighbors or whether it's across the world. I'd like to flip forward to the New Testament. Paul reminds Timothy in 2 Timothy 1, verse 6. This is why I remind you, Timothy, to fan into flames the spiritual gift that God gave you when I laid my hands on you. One of the wonderful traditions of the evangelical church is that we believe that we have each been given one or more gifts. They're there, whether they're being used or not. Timothy, Paul says, don't forget. Fan that thing into flame. Feed that flame, the gift of God which is in you. We all bring something completely unique, completely us, and completely wonderful to the kingdom of God. It's there, waiting to be brought. Something that's been created by God himself with a smile on his face. In you and in me, it's there. And so I want to challenge you with that, leave you that challenge. What is God calling you to do with the hands that he's given you? They're there for a reason. And I believe we discover something much more deep and more powerful when we're willing to uproot and use those hands to do things we would never have imagined. Let's pray for a moment. Father, we desire, above and beyond all other things, to be available for you, for your hand at work in us. And Lord, as we think of Moses, we thank you for his obedience. It meant so much and means so much to us today. But Father, don't let us be stuck in the desert. Let us be looking at what you do, not our own power, and what you want to accomplish. And above all other things, that your name be raised to the ends of the earth. Use our hands, Father, for your name, for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
I invite you now to rise and sing along with me as we sing our praise anthem together.